Um,
Um, things.
yep.
Outlet to outlet is the range that the camera will pick you up in.
Okay. Yep.
The mic's right there.
Okay.
We're starting a little late, so I'll rush through this. Do you want me to move through the slides?
Sure. That's fine.
All right, just say slide or
Okay.
an indication of some kind, and I'll hit next.
Yep.
You can have a lot of fancy animation and stuff, so we'll be fine.
Yep. We've got another couple minutes.
All right.
Yeah, we got.
1:30. Oh, yeah, you're right. I thought that was 1:15.
No.
No, we're good.
Fine. Notes.
This was Forestry, by the way, right?
Yes.
Woo! I like the forest.
Like cutting forest stuff.
All I know is I love forestry. I'm a big fan of trees. I like to think that they're a big fan of me, but I don't know how to talk to them. So who knows?
Hey Rose, I just saw you. Sorry. Oh, welcome in. Doing well.
Oh, is that a house? Wow.
Yeah, I really, that's some
Oh, yeah.
art. I love it.
I love it so much. So cute.
Okay.
My brother, he like refused to learn how to read. He was and slower. Until it was like, okay, it's my
All right, I'll do it myself. Right.
I got that down.
Oh, okay. It's just like the early ones. We're doing workshop started with dandelion.
Cool.
Or speed. Yeah. Try the chocolate.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I know the last one.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm really glad they didn't let us check. Oh, I see. No, I'm not.
I'm
I'm really not.
Serious.
Here's the thing.
Wait, really? Wait. Every one. I'm like, fine. Okay, are you sure? I was just like, oh, like. Okay, sure, okay. Yeah. I'm very happy. Thank you so much, Marianne.
It's a lot. It's like, yeah, I don't know, it's all a pretty big chunk.
But it was really weird. They were like, and first of all, there were a lot more people than like the amount of chocolate that they had, who were actually all the conference people. So it was like,
I didn't recognize.
it's very strange. I wish they had like not gotten my hopes up about it. They like put up the sign and everything, and I was like, oh my gosh, it was my time to shine.
Right day, and then, no,
And then Cindy,
they kept you from the chocolate.
Untitled Chapter, that the guests may leave, the students
Students will be
deal with
here,
all
yeah.
year.
Wait, say it again?
The guests will leave, but the students is who they have to deal with all work.
Yeah,
They,
yeah, that was a COVID. That we made. I agree.
I thought it was very silly how there were only some people who had tablecloths.
They run out of tablecloths.
Huh?
They ran out of tablecloths.
Oh,
That's
that's-
probably it.
And we set up the tablecloths and I would choose, they're like white cloth and like outside and they're clean, I feel like.
Yeah, that's a thing, that's fine.
All right, good to go.
Can we get started?
You were. Yes. Sarah? Sarah, right.
Yes, a few people.
What is, okay. 1:30, almost. Close enough. Not 1 more minute, but anyway. I know I always click on exactly the minute I'm gonna start. So I saw a couple people coming in. But- Well, you ready, Summer?
We're ready.
We're ready. Okay, great. Welcome again to ThinkFOOD at Simon's Rock. I'm Marianne Tedden. I am the director of the Center for Food Studies here. This is our 8th ThinkFOOD conference. And I'm happy to say that our speaker in this session has been to all 8 ThinkFOOD conferences, which is very impressive. So this is Will Conklin. We're really happy to have him speak to us about timber and the Berkshire area. We've heard already today about silvopasturing and agroforestry. So this is a great sort of third session for us. And Will runs Greenagers, which is a local environmental youth organization that does a lot of great work in the area. And he also has his own farm, and he and his wife are 4th generation stewards of that property. So it's a long-term Berkshire resident, and we're happy to have him here. And thanks, Will, for being here.
Thanks, Marianne. Nice to see everybody, and hopefully folks online can see us well. And yeah, this Marianne reached out about this conference, and it sort of hit a couple of the hats that I wear, and made me interested in certainly attending, but also putting together a presentation that covers a little bit of what Greenagers does in the community related to forests and wood products, as well as the hat that I've worn for a number of years in terms of working in the woods and converting trees to timber, and what that means for our community. And probably, if there's one piece of it that makes me the most excited, it's kind of how that piece relates to our community and the sustainability of it, and resiliency of it. So as far as the presentation goes, we're going to start a little bit kind of back in time in a sense, and also hopefully broaden the perspective to something that looks at the consumer lines of how we use our timber and how we bring it into our area, and how far it comes, things of that nature. I figured I'd start with a couple of pictures that just show, again, that community piece, i.e. young people working with trees and wood, and how that interacts with our lives. This obviously is not a historical photo. This is from the Farmer Olympics at Hentuck Shaker Village that Greenagers was a part of a number of years ago. But it's quite fun to see folks of all sizes and ages working with some of the more traditional tools that were used when timber was pretty much only a local resource, except for maybe those big logs that were being shipped back over to Europe in the 17th century. And this is a young woman working a few years ago. We rived some cedar logs and built a tiny little pergola for the 8th grade prom, the Big Boys Middle School. But there's something, there are a few things, at least in my experience, more satisfying, and other folks have a similar experience of seeing what happens when you open a log up into a piece of usable timber, whether that's a half round or something more refined, such as a 2x4. So next slide is fine. So one of the things that I wanted to bring out in this presentation is that I think we can think about our local timber resources in a similar way that we are maybe more, certainly people at this conference are more accustomed to thinking about our food resources. When you say the local food movement, people know what you're talking about there. They know that it's a tomato tastes better when you get it from the farmer down the road in season. And though I don't promote chewing on 2x4s in your home, the sense of building a structure or something of utilitarian nature out of wood that either came from your own woods or came from the woods down the road, and you know the person that cut it, and you know the person that sawed it, things like that, they really matter, both on a community level and also on an economic level. That's, I think, a little more complex of a topic and conversation, but it definitely matters. So I had never really looked into this before, but I kind of did a little bit of research and went back and just to see what Massachusetts looked like in terms of sawmills and what the environment was like for converting trees to timber. And you could just take away that title probably and put dairy farms there, and you'd have a similar metric, if not number. And you could probably extend that to a number of other industries in terms of the outsourcing of our local ability to produce things. So yeah, as you can see, we've declined from 365 sawmills in 1952 down to, and this is mostly self-reporting data these days, I think. But 40 active sawmills, 18 portable mills. One thing that kind of struck me as interesting was that in the 1952 census, they made a point of saying that, and the reason I put that 2/3 stationary in there, they made a point of saying that the trend at that point was towards stationary mills, with the subtext being that there were a fair number of portable mills prior to that. And that was counterintuitive to me. But the idea of a portable sawmill, it actually kind of makes sense in earlier times because hauling around these logs is tough work. So if we can convert it right where it sits, all the better. And then in some ways, the trend is coming back around as evidenced by, and I'll get into this a little more deeply later, but this past year, we wanted to have a small homeowner sawmill at Green Acres on our 100-acre farmstead. I picked up the phone to try to order a mill, and I first called Wood Miser, and they said, well, it's going to be a year. And then I called around the time they said it was going to be 3 months to get a mill. It's been 4 or 5 since then. So with COVID and with lumber prices spiking, the demand for the ability to make your own lumber at a reasonable price really went through the roof. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So maybe the next slide will give us a geographical sense of where those mills were in Massachusetts, as well as the type. See, stationary versus portable. A lot of mills. Yeah. I don't have too much more to stay on that slide. It's just, we were just talking at lunch about, okay, where can you go get locally sawn lumber? And I think at the table, we were able to come up with 5. And one of them was out in this area. And one of them was in this area. One of them was down here in Connecticut. And one over in Norfolk and one over here in New York State. And that's about all we think about in terms of commercial production. There are a number of folks with homeowner, homesteader, light commercial size mills, often portable or quasi-portable in the area. But in terms of a mill that's producing lumber on a regular basis for a significant number of projects, it's pretty low. Pretty low. So then that begs the question, where to go get your lumber? Home Depot being certainly one of the big ones. And where does that come from? And what does the supply chain look like of the wood coming into Home Depot? That's a whole other topic. But the main point that I wanted to make is that when supply chains got disrupted, there was, as we saw with COVID, there was scarcity, there were price increases. You can go to the next slide. Price increases like this. They've since softened, at least in the bulk, maybe not even the wholesale, but certainly in the retail side of things. But those prices they're going to be sticky, as they often are, and the supply chains are just, it's with the bigger anything, a bigger mill, a bigger production site of any kind, it's sometimes harder to put the switch on again. And it's up the way they were. There's probably, when we get into a Q&A toward the end, I'm sure there's other folks in the room that could lend some more color to this picture. But the piece that really struck me was both the pricing going up and then people sort of changing their headspace, changing their gears, thinking about, all right, well, we've got trees around here and we want to make some lumber. Let's figure out how to do it. The other piece, oh no, this slide, that's great. We can go to the next slide. I thought we were just touching briefly on firewood, but so I just came across this picture, and so combining that last statistic with this statistic that construction boomed, which certainly added to the scarcity, Family home construction down 12% last year, remodeling 7%. Meanwhile, our domestic sawmill output rose only 3.5%, which certainly can explain the scarcity. The other piece that caught my attention on this picture was that there's some fairly low quality lumber there, which in this case, you can use the low quality lumber and make it work with a lot of added strength in terms of gussets and so on. But I just saw this twisty 2x4 there and what looked to be a pretty curvy one there. And I just found that kind of interesting in terms of what was being used. And there'd probably be a good debate as to whether that's a good use or bad use, but probably certainly speaks to younger plantation grown lumber at the very least. All right, I'm going to go to the next slide. And then the other piece of the tree and wood industry that it's worth touching on, and this pertains to how we use our timber resources at April Hill. Green Acres is certainly the firewood piece. So thinking about, again, using our local resources to heat our homes and provide fuel is an important consideration versus a product that is traveling long distances, has certain climate effects, and so on and so forth. So go to the next slide. There's our alternative, propane, the one back. Yeah. So that's all in many respects just a preamble to get us to the focus of this particular presentation, which is April Hill Conservation and Recreation Center, owned by Green Acres. A little backstory on the property. Green Acres is a youth organization that works to connect young people to the environment, to the outdoors, to working in conservation and sustainable agriculture. 2.5 years ago now, we were fortunate to become stewards and owners of this property. It's 100 acres in South Egremont, Massachusetts. There's an historic farmstead in that parcel 1 on the map, which includes a house built in 1744, farms built in 1750-ish, and one garage built in 1979. But so we have lots of examples on the farmstead of timber that was harvested quite locally and used quite locally. And thanks to the state of Massachusetts, we now have an updated forest management plan, which this map came out of, made by Adam Brown, Forestry, which gives us a sense of what we have on the property for forest resources. I'll get to a satellite image in a second, but from the houses and farmsteads here, the vast majority of the farm, as you can see it, is mostly hayfields. And so it begs the question, why do you have a forest management plan if you've got 100 acres of mostly hayfields? And there are some forest tracts that you would recognize as forest. White pine stand, an ash substand here, white pine hemlock forest across the road, which is Route 41 for those of you that are relatively local. And then there is big hayfields here, pastures here, and a kind of a scrubby pasture here down there by Great Dogwood. And I kind of, when our management plan was up for renewal, I thought, well, why do we need a forest management plan necessarily? And once I got it back, and then I realized, oh, this is why, because the foresters not only have a great take on what might be done with the actual forest, but they add a lot of color to what's happening with all the tree resources throughout the whole property. There's, for example, the wooded swamp here. There's hedgerows here. This doesn't show it, the next one will, but there are hedgerows, let's see, here and here. And the inventory of the timber species and how well they're doing throughout those parcels is also just hugely important into thinking about, okay, this is the property that we're managing, how are we going to manage it, and more particularly, how are we going to manage the timber resources. So we'll go to this one where there's our satellite photo. We do, yes. So yeah, there you can see right down there, Appalachian Scenic Trail. So we try not to do any cutting down there. No, Yeah, just to orient folks, the village of South Egremont is kind of to the upper right off the map. New York State's over here, not too far away. So homestead's right here, farmstead, house and barns, and then I just kind of put a few labels on there to further illustrate what we have in terms of both the forest resources, but also how we're using them. I guess we can start across the street where, as I mentioned, there's a white pine forest, an eastern white pine hemlock stand, and then some within some of the bigger stands, some white ash. To touch on the white ash in particular, we have it there as well as in the hedgerows, and due to environmental pressures and pests, the emerald ash borer, the ash is declining quite a bit in our area, in New England generally. And so one of the recommendations within that forest plan is to harvest that pretty heavily and try to make use of it before it just becomes a forest of dead pine or ash trees. So we will be looking at that. It'll also be part of managing our hedgerows and taking that dead wood out. In terms of the farm, what we'd ideally like to do is. Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, we'll see what we get out of it. There's more mature ones are over here. So what we pull out of there, we will likely try to convert as much as possible into most likely 1-inch boards, things like flooring or decking in a rustic structure, or we could kiln dry them in one, or air dry them to use for something more refined. And I should mention, if anybody has a question, just no need to wait till the end. As I mentioned, I put an order in for a sawmill for the site, and it's yet to arrive, but when it arrives, we'll probably locate it up there. And so we will process whatever we take off the land right there, and wherever possible, use it on site. We have barns to maintain, and we have a budding trades training program that includes carpentry and woodworking. So we have a lot of uses for wood. I'll get into some of the other species and how we're using them as well. The other main use for the white ash will certainly be for firewood, and we have 2 avenues for that. First avenue would be our community firewood bank, developing and maintaining a stock of well-processed seasoned firewood to work with our local anti-poverty agency, Community Action Council, to distribute that firewood through federal home heat assistance program. And then we are in the process of putting a catalytic wood furnace to heat our greenhouse. And I'll get to a more specific diagram of that in a second, but that's certainly one of the avenues for that fuel wood, as well as the occasional campfire. As a slight aside, we burned quite a bit of wood this past winter because we had school children on site for the entire winter, warming their hands in between their lessons for COVID. Getting back to our other stands, in the main part of the forest, eastern white pine and hemlock, we will certainly manage that, not as intent, or not in that, from a harvesting standpoint, probably not in a different way than one would a traditional stand, and there are conservation restrictions on this parcel and these parcels that limit how much timber we can take and in what way. I believe the limit is a 1/4 acre pocket. Yeah.
What is that clearing near the white ash?
Right here?
Yes, right there.
That's it's a wetland. It used to be a farm pond. This was grazed all down through here. I should mention this pine stand is very low quality pine from a timber standpoint. It's probably, let's see, we're at 2020, so it's maybe 50 years old, 40, 50 years, but very branchy, low quality timber. But that used to be grazing land right down to there. There was a dam that's been breached since. That we still retains a little bit of water, but it's yeah, historically a farm pond.
Well, I guess just.
Yeah.
A larger question.
Great.
It's kind of there, but like, in the early successional farming, just, you know, like it's with all your hay fields. Is there, you want to forest some of it, or head towards more hay, more forest long term?
Yeah. Well, I was talking with Mike Downey, the forester, earlier this morning, a little bit about this, and he's seen the maps, and in particular, at the very least, his talk about how beneficial windrows can be to grass crop. Even just adding more windbreaks can improve the grass quality and give you a longer growing season for that grass, whether it's for grazing or hay.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
You know why that is? It's like more deposit.
I think our grasses, they grow the worst in the heat of the summer. So if you can moderate the temperature, the microclimates in your hay fields, that's certainly one piece. You talked about the effect of the windbreak on whatever crop it is 5 to 10 times the height of it. Yeah, so I think you're getting just a less, trees grow shorter on a windy hilltop, grass grows shorter on a windy field. So it'll be interesting to sort of think along those lines and think along the lines of then, of course, what species we want to plant. We're looking at timber trees, nut trees, fruit trees.
I think NRCS has like one of the practices.
Could be.
Established.
Yeah. And we've already, started integrating some of these declining hedgerows with some plantings of chestnuts, mulberries, and hazelnuts. Yeah.
Once you harvest the white ash, what are your plans for that area? Do you plan something else, or do you?
We haven't really gotten that far along with it in terms of, like, for example, replanting. Tom, actually, somebody asked me this the other day. How do people do a lot of tree planting around here? I went to college in Canada, and up there, tree planting is like a rite of passage for young people. But I've never come across too many sites, except for that's one exception I know of, where they consciously replanted new hardwoods to regenerate an early succession. But how big of a practice is it?
That early successful hardwood stand was one of the only places that I have actually recent past planted that was formerly a softwood plantation, one red pine. So they used NXCS funding for the previous ownership to remove the trees, and then also got some funding from planting. But generally speaking, most people rely on native hardwoods, the native trees that we have, which are very vigorously will repopulate any open area. And a lot of, you can do supplemental planting, but generally you end up eating the deer.
Yeah.
You can also do something very proactive to try to prevent deer from driving.
Yeah.
Those other trees.
Yeah.
Another question, because you're thinking you don't have to now, such a condition with the ash, is there a way to save the ash?
Some ash you can save if you want to actually do a stem injection, but it is quite costly to do a repeat application every couple of years. So it really only makes sense for those high value like yard trees. There is efforts underway by the state forest health program to release they are doing some releasing natural predators available ash for, which they don't know in time to correct itself so that ash will become part of our landscape again. But for the immediate future, it's not a very good future. They are actually finding over 95% mortality than ash, but now I think they're actually finding that they're a little bit better, but still it's pretty rare.
Yeah, so maybe not quite the level of mortality that elms with Dutch elm disease, but close to it. We're looking for those individuals or subspecies that can withstand or adapt to it. Yeah. So, well, that's interesting to hear that. You know, that was my suspicion that there wasn't that much planting around, and the fact that this was one of the few examples, you know, makes it all the more interesting to me. And it's grown up into a nice, you know, thick thicket and stand of. This is probably, they planted that I think around 09, 10, something like that. So it's come along, and the trees are 20 to 30 feet tall. That's it. Saplings, and there's you know, poplars and oaks and other species in there. And you know, when we do take that white ash, we do create big pockets in the forest, and we hope to see other species. You know, maybe some oaks would come in with added light, or other species. But even just managing it to improve the pine and even the hemlock to a certain extent, but even managing it to improve the pine would be great. Pine's a wonderfully utilitarian wood. We'll certainly use any pine or hemlock that we harvest. We'll use the pine and any of the structures and outbuildings for framing members or sheathing, decking. The hemlock, we use a lot of green acres for our raised vegetable program. It's affordable in terms of its prevalence, so it's pretty cheap to buy, and in our case, if we have it and we can mill it, then we don't have to buy it. It's reasonably rapid. I tell people typically 7 years out of a 2-by full 2-by inch thick piece of hemlock for a garden bed. And then the firewood from the white ash will be going. The firewood bank and wood furnace. Went over the chestnuts and mulberries. I think we can move on to the next slide. Just a few clips of what some of these species that we're talking about look like. From a fruiting standpoint, these are mulberries and the chestnut. We're a long way from fruiting on both of those, but they'll be along. Next slide. There's your white ash, tree form, boards, and firewood. Here's one for the room. Also in the last 2 days, 2 people have asked me, why can you burn white ash green, i.e. unseasoned? Huh?
It naturally has a low moisture.
Just low moisture content. There you go. Occam's razor works there. Eastern white pine. Again, you know, ubiquitous in terms of framing and flooring and decking and all kinds of other uses, especially historically, but to this day, everything from you know, interior tongue roof, shiplap, rustic flooring, all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was traditionally used that way. For example, in the farmhouse of Green Acres, big wide pine flooring. But I mean, I think they probably saw that out of whatever tree they had, and it was probably a little bit more durable than what we have now because it's growing slower. But if you put it down now, you get a nice rustic floor. Look, it's bent it up and it's stained. It looks pretty good.
The older plants would have grown further, because now
Yeah.
they put the grow method, which makes it weak.
Yeah, they grew under, you know, for longer and more competition. No, yeah.
I was part of the historic.
Definitely. Move on to the next slide. There's your hemlock. also a great, it's great utilitarian lumber. Tends to be more splintered handling and putting into areas where, unless it's really planed and sanded, you don't want to, especially have young folks handling it for the splinters. Also subject to wind shake where the growth will separate. Gotta watch out for that. It'll really degrade a log quickly. Log bridge, good question. So Green Acres, one of the main things we do is trail building with our youth crews, and in wet areas of hiking trails, one of the strategies to get people across these wet areas is to build bog bridges. Essentially, take 2 or 3 of these planks, typically a 2x8 or a 2x10, and then if you go to the next slide, take a small round of black locust and flatten it on both sides with a short piece on either end, run your planks across, and you've got a nice way to get across a wet area without too much impact.
I didn't know what those
I don't know, there's probably other names for them too. That's what we call them.
There's quite a few on the turf,
Yeah.
especially in the latter part if you cross Simon's Rock and move it towards Alfred Road.
Interpretive trail on campus.
Sure. Yeah. And I put this one up here. It's not a native species. We don't have it at April Hill or Green Acres, but we use it a ton. In the bog bridges, those base logs, we try to get black locust for that. We use it a ton on the farm for our fence posts. Anywhere you want something to withstand the forces of decay and rot, the black locust is your great choice. Yeah.
Yeah, thinking more about black locust. I mean, it's native of Pennsylvania and south.
Yes. Middle Atlantic. Yeah.
And do you get a sense, because we have a few massive ones right along the roadside that look like they're spaced and looks.
Oh yeah. Yep. That's how it advanced as quickly as it did. People saw the utility, planted it, around old farmsteads, and then
And it's that seed.
it sets seed. It also goes rhizomatically. It's a very clever tree, and it's a legume. It's a nitrogen fixer too. So.
And unfortunately listed as do not transport to Massachusetts, illegal itself.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It looks like we're making very bold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty too.
It's it's got a very charismatic growth habit, both in its limbs and its deep furrows, and it's maddening for a sawyer, but but it's cool. And if it, especially at the farm, we try to get stuff for fence posts. Some for about 5 inches in diameter, we use them as so. But if we get any bigger, if it's reasonably straight, it'll ride really nicely. You can just put a steel wedge in there and drive it with a ball, and that thing just wants to come apart. All of a sudden, you paid a certain amount for one stick, and you've got 2 or 4 fairly short order. Sometimes the kids don't believe you when I tell them. It's not too much work, as long as it's straight. And it's beautiful lumber. Comes out of kind of a honey-colored wood. Put a little oil on it. It's really quite nice. I've seen it used for outdoor decking, shape it, and it'll withstand everything. Just make sure you bring your drill bits to pre-drill it. Very hard.
Does it also have a liquid pathway?
It does have a little fat, some allelopathogens there. I don't know if it's actually allelopathogens or some other toxin, but yeah, it doesn't play well with others. All right, moving on to the next. Where we at? Oh, and I just thought I'd, sort of talking terminology on sawmills and saying, hey, this, we bought a bandsaw and talking historically, so I just thought I'd throw up a couple of pictures of what it actually looks like in places that are converting trees to timber. This is kind of your classic circular sawmill, and it's looks really scary and takes a big swath out of relatively big swath out of the log, a 1/4 inch kerf, a lot of sawdust, but really fast and doesn't, that kind of blade won't deflect you hit nuts and stuff like that. Generally speaking, you might get over a whole run of wood, a truer edges on your boards. We'll go to the next one. There's an example of kind of your classic hobby homestead band mill. You know, fairly slow, but they get the job done. And if you just need a little bit longer and want to experience that feeling that I mentioned at the start of the presentation of seeing a log open up into the boards, it gives just the same effect.
Will you describe exactly what it's doing?
Yeah. So he's looks like a white pine to me, given the blue stain on the outside. He's I don't see any. Probably had a machine or something. I don't see any ramps to see how he actually got that onto the log deck there. But you've got a log deck. You get your log on the log deck. Get some clamps or dogs on there to hold it still. And he's come through. I was making 1-inch board, so he's probably come through 5 or 6 passes already on that board. He took off the top slab with the rounded top. We put that off the side in the slab pile, and he's going through and through, flip sawing the log, which essentially means it's going right down through as it sits. And what you wind up with is a whole flitch of boards in order for that log. You know, he may come back and edge those to some wide plank boards, 1x12s, 14/16s, or he may leave that live edge on it for something more creative, or if you've, especially up in the Adirondacks, if you've seen the cabins with all the live edge siding, that kind of Adirondack siding is popular up there. It's one of my favorite.
Is that similar to the Sawmill that you have on the board?
That's very similar. Yeah, I ordered an Oscar 336, which is a bigger motor and capacity, but pretty similar. This company is fairly local. They've got distributorships. I think the main factory might be in Ontario, but it's in this, you know, not too far away.
And you move logs that are on the tractor.
Yeah. We would, although, you know, you can, with these mills and ones that are slightly higher up, like the one I have on my farm. Well, my farm has a hydraulic arm that loads the logs on and onto the log deck, because that log deck is higher. But a simple ramp, you could even get a load delivered by a log truck, and if you're positioned well, you can handle everything from there by hand with PV and people. Again, it's slow, it's hard work, but it's not too bad. I mentioned the fuel wood aspect of what we're working on at Green Acres. In addition to putting good seasoned wood out to folks that need it, we're putting in a boiler to heat the greenhouse. Ours happens to be by central boiler, and it's has a catalytic secondary burn in it. So, you know, they claim somewhere around 85% efficiency, I think. Maybe 90 of it? Yeah. Well,
And how's
we'll stay conservative.
how's the distribution of
So basically these furnaces are set up with a burn chamber in them, and then a water jacket heating the water. And then in our case, it'll be insulated Thermopax pipe from there into the greenhouse. And there'll be a couple of different ways. We're actually going to focus on root zone heating, both either in the ground or in propagation tables to use that heat as efficiently as possible. In the case of plants, it's the root zone is the actually more important place to have heat. That way you don't have to have a greenhouse at 80 degrees. You can keep your air temperature at 50 and still be growing greens. So on. So we'll have a couple of different. It'll probably also go to a Modine style heater for heating the air, as well as you need to have what do they call it, a place for the heat to a heat dump. You know, sometimes they can get reproducing too much heat. You won't be able to have a place for that for a while.
And is there a backup system?
Water. For the green, no, we won't have a backup. See how that goes.
They actually now have a tax, will send you a tax when you get refill. The boiler will send you a tax. That means take more wood. So.
There you go.
Well, you can actually open up an app on your phone to monitor the system, so it's called Firestar. It's really high tech.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Okay, farming these days is easy, you know, with the robotic milkers, they just send you a text if the cow needs more grain, the thinness, sends you a text when it needs more wood, I mean, it's really.
And how big was it take for?
I forget how deep the firebox is, but this, particularly with the catalytic versions, they want a well-seasoned wood, you know, probably ideally, you know, 20% moisture content or below. Yeah, like I said, I forget, probably, how deep is the firebox now, 24 inches?
I think, yeah, that could take 20 something.
Yeah.
Long, and it's a large fire, they're expanding, you can get easily 12 or 18 hours.
Yeah, yeah, you can.
And it's efficient, you know. They're now built to 20, the highest standards for the EPA.
Yep.
So
And that means that's the year-round maintenance.
Yep.
Water, you go.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, my Tom said this is the one we got was 760, I think. Yeah, 2020 EPA standards. Massachusetts. I had a hiccup after I ordered it, just because, you know, like, oh, it's EPA great. Then Massachusetts, of course, we have our own standards, but thankfully this is also on that. Yeah. And then I thought I'd throw in a few slides of how we're, you know, some projects where we're using this wood. So got black locust posts in the ground, some hemlock framing waiting to go. We're building some tent platforms. We'll go to the next. There's a finished tent platform that the only thing that we didn't saw was the white cedar decking in there. We've got a red cedar log going in for a trail bridge in Pittsfield. Got some, also in Pittsfield, the Springside Park, we felled some big hemlocks. Our friend Sean Stanton brought his horses in and dragged the logs to where we needed them. And we flattened and built a pedestrian and bike bridge. And next slide. Which ones?
The bike version.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're not as cool. They're very new, so they're coming along.
Cool, awesome. There's some pictures of young people, again, with the Greenacres Connection, actually getting involved in their local wood resource. And this one was from this spring. It was just super fun, so I had to include it over in New York State, where there tends to be more black locust growing. There was a very steep section of trail that needed a staircase. So we felled some locust and we ripped it down the middle. Made 4 40-foot stringers. This is one flight. There's a flight below, see. And the next slide. That's all black locust, the treads, the stringers, the posts, the rail.
That's it.
What's that?
For us, like.
Oh, that's it.
So,
we're
yeah.
2 minutes.
Yeah, we have a couple minutes of questions.
How do you prevent the structures from eroding?
Put a good roof on them and use the right wood in the right place. And
What I mean, like with the staircase, like, you know.
staircase. Locust, that'll be there for probably 30 years. I mean, for a trail structure, it's just super, you know, you hear all these stories about black locust, the old, like for example, old timers say, put a black locust post and put a stone on top of it, the stone will be gone before the post. But especially depending on how well drained the soil is, it can stay around a long time. You know, you can come across posts that are 50 years old. But to not be quite so hyperbolic, you know, certainly, you'll certainly get 20 years out of it. Actually, probably close to 30, especially something so big and chunky. You know, typically with some of these rot-resistant species, the sapwood starts to go earlier, so like the red cedar, for example, in the code book, they want you to use red cedar with heartwood that's at least, I think, 60 or 70% heartwood, because that white outer sapwood rots away quickly. Black locust, you can barely, sometimes you can barely see the sapwood on it, and that's the most prone piece of it, and it's not there. Yeah, we have, you know.
Well, thank you for. I can't say enough about the good work that Green Acres does in the community, and April Hill especially. It's really going to be an amazing resource. So thank you all for coming. We're going to take a little break and switch off to the keynote, which will be at 2:30. So if you're with us on Zoom, you have another link to go to the keynote. But thanks for coming. Thanks, Will.
Thank you, man.
Yeah. That's an amazing circuit.
That was fun.
That's kids too, or?
Yeah, that was a youth crew and the pathway.
Wow.